hogs, a herd. But
I don't know.
all of a sudden, there was all this commotion down in the valley.
So it was hogs?
Yeah.
And dinner.
But the scream and shrill, initially we thought it was a human voice.
Huh. Well, I was walking up there Saturday and I heard this sort of a grunt like, and it was something, so I looked over to my left down in the little hollow there, and I saw this one big one, and then there was about 5 or 6 more ran on up the hollow the way I was going.
Is there open season on hogs?
As far as I'm concerned, it's open season all the time. And they do. I mean, they kill them down there whenever they can.
We startled one day. We were hiking in Frozen Head, and it was down. We were, on the ridge. And it was down in the valley. And I don't know. Well, from what you said, it ran up the hill and over the ridge. So maybe it was going on the backside.
Yeah.
But I thought that unusual to get away from us, that it got closer to us and crossed our path. It was away from us.
I think you'd go the other way,
But boy, they can move. You don't have your sombrero. Have you declared that it's
No, I have it. I just didn't. I remembered to take it off before I got up here today.
Oh, okay. So it's still not officially summer.
No. Well, that is my summer hat, so even when it's summer, it'll be all right.
It's not for heat, it's for...
Yeah, that one's really thin and breathable. I've got wool ones that I wear in the winter, which work quite well, actually. Oh, man. I've got the yawns.
Gary, you're changing up the tea?
Changing up the tea.
Yeah. You got something in your hand. It looks like you're going to drink that and not Rick's high-priced coffee.
Yeah, well, my stomach is not behaving properly.
Well, if your stomach is not in good shape, I'd suggest you don't have Rick's coffee. That might injure.
I like Rick's coffee.
Yeah.
I just don't think my stomach will like it today.
How is everybody? Good. We got more announcements today. They filled up the page again. They were looking a little peaked last Sunday. Okay, it's 10. I'm still yawning, but we'll get started with the announcements. Let's see. Family Life Committee members are encouraged to come this afternoon around 4 p.m. to help the youth with setting up the tables and preparing for the food serving this evening, which segues into the next one, which is this evening's spaghetti dinner and dessert auction, which is for Passport Camp. So hopefully have a good turnout. Hopefully the spaghetti will be good that the youth are making, and I'm sure the desserts will be good, but show up and buy some desserts, and they're hoping to raise $4,000 to get everybody that needs to go to camp. That's children and chaperones and everything, so I'm sure it'll work out. But those who are, part of the Family Life Committee, they're asking to be there at 4 to help get the logistics taken care of to prepare for the spaghetti dinner and dessert auction. There are some video cassettes down in the church library. They are removing those from the library, and so they're available for anyone to take free of charge, but a monetary donation to the church library is always welcome. If you have a graduating senior in your family, let the church office know, and you give them an email, fbcoffice@fbcoakridge.org, and they want to know the student's full name, his or her connection to First Baptist Church, and when and from what school the graduate is graduating from. And this is all just so that the graduates' names can be published in the first light that we all get, or that they send out. I assume we all get it. I get email and physical mail, so I get double first light. And the next announcement is for the May Fellowship Table next month, which will be on Friday, May the 13th. So it's Friday the 13th Fellowship Table. Same as always, it's from noon to 1 p.m. In the Fellowship Hall. Everyone in the community, or anyone in the community, is not everyone, they probably don't have enough for that, but anyone in the community is invited to come. $5 per ticket, which can be purchased the Sunday before the Fellowship Hall, the Sunday before, May 13th. And you can purchase those in the narthex before and after service. So it says the main entree will be Mexican tacos and casseroles. That sounds really good. Casserole. I think I used plural.
Cinco de Mayo late, huh?
Yes. Late Cinco de Mayo. VBS training. So all the VBS volunteers, we have to have or attend one of two scheduled trainings. Both of these trainings are identical. The first one will be on May the 22nd. That's at 10 a.m. in room 105. The second option is Tuesday, May the 24th at 6:30 p.m. in room 105. So if you're planning on helping out with VBS, this training is required for the church to meet their safety and requirements and everything for adults and children and all that sort of stuff. Says monthly potluck dinners will resume Wednesday, May 25th at 5:30 in the Fellowship Hall. So May 25th, Wednesday, will be the first time we've had a potluck dinner in a long time before Bible study. So that's kind of cool. It says enough fried chicken will be provided for everyone at no charge. Bring your favorite entree, side dish, or dessert to share. So that's everybody chows down and then sleeps through Bible study. I'm just kidding. Don't sleep. And then Passport Kids Camp meeting for kids and parents is on June the 5th at noon in room 105. And that's it. That's all the announcements. Let's go ahead and pray before Sunday school, and then I have a handout I'll give to you guys. Dear Lord, we just thank you so much for this beautiful day, for this beautiful weather, and for this, for just another opportunity to gather together with our brothers and sisters in your name, Lord, to learn about you, to think about you, to steer our hearts towards you in worship and prayer and study and thought and meditation, Lord. And we just pray that you would bless our time here, that you would receive our worship, and that you would make us more like Jesus with each and every passing day, and help us to be a light to the world in your name and for the salvation of everyone. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so let me hand these out real quick. Just for a bit of reference, I didn't want to assume everybody would just remember this. I don't plan on reading it a bunch, so you'll have a piece of paper to look at.
Contingency. Oh, okay. I guess I haven't seen that word often.
It's been a while since, I don't know how many people use the word contingent on a regular basis, but
in the military, you use it frequently.
You always have a backup.
That's right. You always have a contingency plan, right?
Call it.
So, this probably gives away the fact that we're going to talk about this argument today.
It gets bad when you have to have backup for backup.
All right, so we've wrapped up our discussion at this point on how our belief in God doesn't actually require any arguments for that belief to be warranted. And so that may be a strange way to get started in natural theology, given that the task or the traditional task of natural theology is to develop arguments for the existence of God. But I think it's, of good value to consider the proposition that at the most fundamental level, belief in God needs no such arguments, and that belief can be warranted in a properly basic way through the witness of the Holy Spirit. Nevertheless, having arguments and being able to provide arguments and evidences for the great truths of Christianity can be of immense value. So to say that arguments, for God's existence are not necessary to know that God exists or that Christ is risen, that sort of thing, is not to say that these arguments aren't sufficient for, knowledge of God, knowledge about these things. Even though certain Christian beliefs, as we've discussed, are properly basic, there are still good arguments and evidences that also warrant belief in these things. Not everyone's going to arrive at the truth of God's existence or the truth of the, those essential ingredients to the gospel message, solely through the formation of properly basic beliefs. Many will come to embrace these things, to acknowledge them as true through arguments and evidence for these things. I've seen it happen many times. So today we're going to begin looking at some of the arguments for God's existence in particular. And the first argument we're going to look at is the argument from contingency. This argument is sometimes called the Leibnizian Argument, and it's named after the reason it's called that is due to the name of the German philosopher who really put it forward. His name was Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. 1646 to 1716.
He's also a mathematician.
Yes, mathematician.
That's the same one.
He's a bit of a polymath, but yes.
He also came up with calculus.
Yep. Yeah, and there was some controversy there. Yeah. Did he come up with calculus? But now I think most people do attribute to Leibniz who was the other. They basically it's understood nowadays that Leibniz and whoever the other guy was were both working on calculus.
The other guy was the guy independent. The attribution for a long time.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm gonna have to look at
Newton.
Yeah, it was Newton. Yeah, it was Newton.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so they came to they finally settled on the fact that it appears that both of these, Newton and Leibniz, were actually working independently on, calculus.
How amazing is that?
Right.
At the same, essentially the same time.
Pretty brilliant guys with a similar mathematical background.
Yeah.
It bears fruit to your idea that people can come to the truth of God through different directions.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so they came to the truth of the universe through different directions.
Well, yes. Yeah, I mean, they people that think a lot, on these things, and their thoughts were fruitful and were rewarded from them centuries later.
Well, as was said by somebody, I think it was Newton, it says, the only reason I did so well is I stood on the shoulders of giants.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
They both had the same giants to work from. Yeah,
that's true of so much, progress is standing on the shoulders of giants. But yes. But Leibniz in particular, being the philosopher that he was, he once stated that the first question which should rightly be asked by anyone, is why is there something rather than nothing? Leibniz eventually came to the conclusion that the answer to this question cannot be found within the universe of created things, but rather in a transcendent cause of the universe, which Leibniz understood to be God. According to Leibniz, God exists necessarily and is the explanation for why anything else exists. We've talked about this in the past about God being a necessary being when we were talking about his aseity and some other things. Leibniz really put this forward and put this into argument. The gist of Leibniz argument has been put into simpler terms by modern philosophers, which makes his reasoning a little clearer, and so that's what you have in front of you on that paper is kind of the result of that. His was quite complex, but the argument goes as follows, and this is what's written on the handout that I gave you. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. That's the first premise. Premise 2, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. Premise 3, the universe exists, so the conclusion is, therefore, the explanation of the existence of the universe is God. So logically, this argument is airtight. If those three premises are true, then it logically follows that the conclusion is also true. So anyone who wishes to reject the conclusion of this argument has to say that at least one of those three premises is false. So we're going to look at the premises. We're going to dive into the argument. I don't know if anyone who would sincerely reject premise 3, since it just seems to be universally known to be true, that the universe does in fact exist. That just seems to be obviously true. So the skeptic is really going to have to deny either premise 1 or 2.
Except for the people that believe that existence is a simulation.
Yes, yes.
But in that sense, then the simulation exists.
You're just pushing it back a little bit further. You're just muddying the water. But yeah, so we can dismiss that right away, and we will, because I don't have time to talk about those other ideas. We're just going to assume premise 3 is you don't believe in incontrovertible. So the question boils down to this: is the truth of each of the first two premises more plausible than not? So let's look at them and make our own determination. Premise 1: everything that exists has a cause, I'm mixing up two different arguments. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause.
What does in the necessity of its own nature mean?
It just essentially means, well, we'll talk about it. So notice that Leibniz makes a distinction here between these two types of being. The first type is a necessary being. This is a being that exists just necessarily. There is no explanation beyond that. It exists by a necessity of its own nature. The idea here is that it's impossible for this thing to not exist. This is something that cannot fail to exist. Its non-existence is impossible. And so for, to not just go directly to God, so another, probably the best and most popular example of this are mathematical objects. Mathematical objects are often understood to exist necessarily. If anything, what would you say caused them? They don't seem to stand in relation to anything as needing a cause for their existence. They're just there. Now, not everybody believes mathematical objects are real in the really real sense, like in the Platonic sense. But even the people who think that mathematical objects are they're anti-realists about mathematical objects. They don't believe they actually exist. They do recognize that if mathematical objects did really exist, they would be necessary. They don't need anything further to explain their existence. It's just impossible for them not to exist in that case.
The deeper you get into mathematics, the closer you get to God.
I think there's a good argument for that. But that's also, but that's an analogy besides going to God of something that exists necessarily, something that many believe is an example of something that exists necessarily. Mathematical entities, and sets, collections of, say, prime numbers, 2, 3, and 4, or all the prime numbers minus 1, any kind of set you want to come up with, that sort of thing. Their existence is not caused by something else. They just are. And so they simply exist by a necessity of their own nature. So that's the best example I think I can give without just, referring to God as a necessary entity.
Well, the number pi is inherent in the universe. Mm-hmm. It is, as you point out, it's the necessity of its own nature.
Right. It's like, and you could say the same thing for the number 2. How do you talk? And so,
but 2's got physical reality.
Well, it does.
Discover, and until you discover it, it's magic.
Yeah.
In fact, I was at a symposium where somebody had filled the blackboard with abstract astrophysics equations,
Uh-huh.
and somebody came in and wrote on top of it mathemagics.
Mathemagics, that's a good one.
Balance and relationships.
That's funny. I like mathemagics. So then the other type of being that Leibniz mentions are those things that exist contingently. These are things that if you don't exist necessarily, then it exists contingently. Contingent beings are things that exist, but they don't have to exist. Their non-existence is possible. It is possible for them to not exist. This is the case for pretty much anything you want to point at in the material world, people, and it gets, planets, galaxies, and so on and so forth. All of these things exist, but they don't have to. They don't exist necessarily. We can easily imagine a possible world, where any or all of these things just don't exist. They all have explanations outside of themselves for why they exist. So when Leibniz says that everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, that explanation could be one of these two that were just described. The explanation for something's existence is either it exists necessarily or it has a cause outside of itself for its existence. It's contingent. If God exists, God is a being that would exist necessarily of its own nature. It's impossible for God to be caused by something else because, if God were caused by something else, then, that thing would be greater than God and God would not be God. That, that other thing would be God, so on and so forth. So the very concept of God requires that God not be caused to exist by something else. God exists necessarily. So as you can see, Leibniz argument is kind of driving us forward towards this idea of this being that exists by a necessity of its own nature, a necessary being. And that's how Leibniz arrived at God. Leibniz called this argument the principle of sufficient reason. And so that's really all there is to premise one. All things have an explanation for why they exist, and the explanation is either that thing exists necessarily or that it has an external cause for its existence. It exists as a result of some external cause. So what, reason might be offered for thinking that this premise one, is true? It does seem, pretty obvious to me, at least, that premise one is true. For one, and I would assume we're all probably in the same boat here, I just naturally recognize that there needs to be some sort of explanation for why, something exists, given that its non-existence is possible. And so, and a good way of thinking about this, or a good illustration of this, was put forward by the 20th century philosopher Richard Taylor, and he building on Leibniz, principle of sufficient reason. Taylor gives this illustration of some hikers or whatever strolling through the woods, and they come upon this large, perfectly smooth, translucent ball, and I think Taylor described it as being, like as tall as a person. Anyway, you're just walking through the woods. Maybe you're picking up sticks for campfire, and you just come across this large, smooth, translucent ball. Taylor points out that whatever else you might wonder about this ball, there is one thing that you would hardly question, and that's that the ball didn't just appear there all on its own, all by itself. The ball owes its existence to something. There must be, an explanation for how it came to be there. And the idea that the ball just, simply popped into existence out of nothing is an idea that few would accept. And now, going a bit further, let's increase the ball to the size of a house or a large building, or even the size of a planet or a galaxy. No matter how big you make the ball, you don't escape the problem of the fact that this thing owes its existence to something else. So merely increasing the size does nothing to escape the question of how it came to be, how it came to exist. Something is responsible for the existence of this mysterious ball. And so the same principle applies to, Earth, to the Milky Way, the galaxy that it's a part of, to the universe. And so, that's I think, a really good illustration of, this argument that, things that, exist, they have to have an explanation. Now, for the other part of the premise, for the other type of existence, the necessary being, I admit when I first encountered the idea of a necessary being, I was puzzled at first just because I had never even thought about it really. I had never, well, not in that way. I realized that that I had, kind of thought about it before, but I was puzzled. But the logic, quickly became very clear for this concept, for the concept of a necessary being. It just makes logical sense that if everything, that begins to exist, or everything that exists has a cause for its existence, then there must be like a first cause. Otherwise, you just have this infinite regress of causes into the past, which doesn't really, it doesn't really make much sense. There has to be this first thing that caused it. So acknowledging the need for an uncaused entity whose existence is necessary is not any sort of, it's not like special pleading for the existence of God or anything like that. It just makes logical sense. Even, the atheist recognizes the truth of this logic. It's just that instead of acknowledging God as the first cause, they'll basically replace God with the universe itself. The atheist, a common atheist argument is that, the universe just exists inexplicably. You don't have to go beyond that. The universe is just here. Everything in the universe has an explanation for its existence, and we should, find out what that is. But the universe itself is somehow, off the hook when it comes to for why it exists. It just exists inexplicably. It doesn't have or need an explanation for its existence. And you can probably see the weakness of this, of this position, but we'll talk about it some more. Atheists will sometimes say that premise one is true of everything, in the universe, but it's not true of the universe itself. Everything in the universe has an explanation, but the universe itself has no explanation. You can probably recognize the weakness of this, but it's also important to point out that this argument commits a fallacy, a type of logical fallacy. And so a fallacy is just an error in reasoning. That can be, that can involve breaking the rules of logic, or it can be defective in some other sense, such as they're often called formal, fallacies or informal fallacies. An informal fallacy would be something like circular reasoning, where you assume the truth of your premises, you assume the truth of your conclusion in your premises, and so you fail to even argue that your premises are true. You just assume the truth of your conclusion. That would be like an informal fallacy, and this one would fall into that kind of informal category. If someone tries to argue that everything in the universe requires an explanation for its existence, but then they say the universe has no such requirement, then this person is committing a fallacy. And this has actually been called the Taxicab Fallacy. It's named that after something that the 19th century philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer said. He was actually talking about this particular conversation here. Schopenhauer pointed out that premise one can't just be dismissed like a hack once you've arrived at your desired destination. You can't say that everything has an explanation for its existence and then suddenly exempt the universe from that. So later philosophers started calling it the taxicab, because, you get to where you're going and then you just dismiss, you don't need the argument anymore. You've arrived at atheism, that sort of thing. So, it would be arbitrary for the atheist to claim that the universe is the exception to the rule. And recall that Leibniz does not do this. Leibniz does not make God out as an exception to premise one. He just he includes him in the type of being that would exist necessarily. He points out that God is a necessary being. So that's his explanation. Also, the claim that the universe has no explanation for its existence, it has other problems. For one, it flies in the face of modern science. you have the study of cosmology, which is literally the study of the universe, and is devoted to the search of the explanation for, the universe, for the universe's existence. So this kind of attitude would, it would cripple science. It would just say that this science, it can show us nothing by saying that the universe just exists inexplicably. So why would anyone actually do this? Why would anyone try to argue that the universe has no explanation for its existence? And the reason is because if the universe does have an explanation for its existence, then you have to have some sort of prior state of affairs in which the universe did not exist. And when you get to that point, when you get to before the universe, there is just nothing. The universe, prior to the universe, there was just nothing. Because the universe is what contains everything that we consider something. So there was literally not anything prior to the existence of the universe. So
you need to specify not anything physical?
No. Well, I guess, but I guess, yes, it's hard. It's funny that it's a hard, I had some note, it's hard to think about nothing because we don't know what that is, but literally it's not anything. So everything that, every bit of matter or particles which make up matter all exist within the universe. Time and space itself are made up of, they are things. They are physical. They are part of the universe. So before the universe, none of the things that we would call something existed. So it was prior to the universe, you literally have not anything, which is what nothing means in this case. It doesn't mean like the empty vacuum of space or something like that, because that itself is a material part of the universe.
Yeah, I guess I'm asking in relation to something like math concepts.
Yes.
Sure.
Well,
They're
that's
not physical.
That's why math actually works as an example of a necessary being.
I'm thinking of music. There's laws and balances to music. Songs usually start and end at the same note. And I'm thinking of art, the composition. I'm remodeling my living room,
mm-hmm.
and the curtains have a certain weight, and the couch has a certain weight, an aspect of where you're going to place it, and
mm-hmm.
this part has to balance with that part, and these colors balance with that part.
Well, a lot of that at the foundation of when you're talking about the balance and some other, there is some math involved there.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's like the other side of math.
Yeah. So it's what you're using. Yeah. I wouldn't say that art is a necessary, being or something like that. I don't think it would work. I think that would fall apart because we just kind of perceive, I don't know, art's a little more subjective, I think. But numbers, math, again, is probably the best example that I can come up with for what some philosophers would consider a necessary entity. If numbers did exist, if they were real things, they would be necessary. We don't have anything to attribute their cause to, if you're again, we're not thinking about God. So if you're just if you're just assuming that getting back to the question as to why would anyone try to argue that the universe just exists inexplicably, it's because then they're faced with the fact that there was just nothing before the universe, and you would have to come up with, then why did the universe come into existence? And that's when if you're an atheist, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place there. But the argument itself just assumes that the universe is all there is. So it also, that commits another fallacy on its own. It's circular reasoning. You're just assuming the truth of your conclusion. Your premises assumes the truth of the conclusion, arguing that the universe is all there is, and it has no explanation for its existence. Just assumes atheism is true, right? Because if you go beyond it, you have to start figuring out, well, if the universe does have an explanation for its existence, you have to ask the question, what is that? And then, atheism is no longer true. So you can't just assume it's true if you want to object Leibniz's argument. You have to show that your argument is true through sound argument, through premises and a conclusion that logically follows, which saying the universe just exists inexplicably does not do. So what Leibniz is getting at, though, is that God, a necessary being, is the explanation for the contingent existence of the universe and everything that's in it. And I'm glad you brought up I almost wrote, I almost was going to intentionally go into the concept of nothing, because it is kind of hard to, a lot of times when people think about nothing, you still end up thinking about something, because it's hard to think about nothing, so without going directly to God, it's hard to think about prior to the universe, because it's hard to think about not anything. That's not something we perceive or experience as contingent beings.
You have to have something to create something.
Right. You can't, something does not come into existence out of nothing, which helps, make sense of Leibniz argument that, everything that exists has an explanation for its existence, either of a necessity of its own nature or an external cause. And so Leibniz believed that God was is a necessary being, and also the cause of the universe and everything within it. So there's more arguments, and we're going to talk more about some arguments and then counter arguments to those arguments. Next week we'll talk a little bit more about the argument from contingency, and before we move on to the next. I think we're going to do 4 or 5 arguments for the existence of God, and we'll kind of look at all of them, the premises, the conclusion, and kind of, dissect every part of that, and then look at some, atheistic arguments or other arguments against them, and weigh them and see which has the most, which makes the most sense, has the most explanatory power, and that sort of thing. So that's, so we're good. You guys got any more questions or?
Sounds like you could start a series on theology from people that we know better as mathematicians.
Well, yeah. Well, and then
Taylor too, right?
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Taylor series.
Yeah. Richard Taylor. I mean, he was, he gave the illustration of the translucent ball, building on Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason. Then when we get to the Kalam cosmological argument, which there's some similarities, but the Kalam cosmological argument, which I gave as our introductory argument kind of example, is that everything that begins to exist has a cause, so it brings time into it. And you start talking about, can there actually be an infinite amount of things? Can something actually exist infinitely in the past, and that sort of thing? So it gets a little more complicated.
Going smaller and smaller and smaller to the atom, and getting smaller.
Yeah, except you would do it. Well, you would just do it. That can actually happen to a certain degree. I think we can get all the way back to nothing, but with time, can you actually have a real infinite in the world and that sort of thing? That's the Kalam cosmological argument brings up those it opens that can of worms.
Well, our idea of nothing actually is space without anything in it, but space is still something.
Space is in it, yes, yeah. Exactly. That's typically, and that's just, because it's hard to imagine not anything.
Seems like the atheist, once you got down to the point where, God had to be the creation of this,
Mm-hmm.
It seems like the atheist could say, okay, if I accept that, then what created God?
Well, that would just avoid the fact that you're already explaining God's existence as being by a necessity of his own nature.
And you come back with you can't have something from nothing.
Right. So, if something created God, then God's just not God, and that's something that created him is. So it doesn't, but you have to get to that first uncaused cause, basically. I think Thomas Aquinas kind of put it that way. The unmoved mover, or something to that effect.
And the definition of God is the thing that caused everything.
Yeah, I mean that's one thing we attribute to God, and there's arguments for why you also get into arguments for why that thing needs to be, would be something like an unembodied mind, which has no physical, material makeup. It needs to be personal, because something that exists, timelessly, in order for it to just all of a sudden do something, it has to kind of like make a decision or have will to bring something into existence, that sort of thing. So it gets pretty complex, but it's really interesting. But we'll look at some more arguments with the against, and then also for and against the contingency, the argument from contingency next week, and then we'll move through more and more arguments. And the moral argument, we'll talk about the argument for the moral argument, the teleological argument, which is basically the fine tuning of the universe and that sort of thing. That's another one. So we'll get through them though. But this is all. These are the more popular, kind of the main arguments that come from natural theology. These arguments for the existence of God that don't appeal to religious text, to scripture and things like that. We're just taking into consideration the created order, the cosmos, and how it works, and how we perceive it, and what we can learn from it, that sort of thing.
I think it's interesting, the idea of the simulation, at least for me, might help me get a better concept of what nothing could be like in relation to our physical reality. Because if you think about if you do something on a computer and you create a simulation, well, what's the before of the simulation? Like, that's kind of one way to think about nothingness. Like, there really isn't anything, right? Like, you haven't written the program. There's no you're not doing anything like
I can see what you're saying. You are creating it and bringing it into existence. So there's something outside of there's something that's not it. But I can see what you're saying.
Something totally outside of the realm of if the simulation has a consciousness, right? Like, you as the creator are totally outside of what that consciousness can kind of, I don't know, appreciate.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the right word, but apprehend.
It's hard. When I think about nothingness, all I think about is black.
Yeah. It's
not because it's space or anything, because there's just no, I guess without light, I just think of blackness. It's hard to think about. So you really just have to kind of do this and talk about it and try to drill. But the concept of nothingness, I think just makes sense to everybody. As a concept, it makes sense. It's just something that's hard to imagine it.
It makes sense that there's an opposite to, or a negation of like everything that we understand.
Right,
so
everything that exists, or
even if,
the material.
Even if you can't experience it.
Right. Yes, we can still make sense of the concept. But all right, it's 10:40. It's time for everybody to start moving to their next duty station.
Yep.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
I'll confuse you.